Please welcome to the stage Mary Harvey of the Center for Sport and Human Rights and our esteemed panel.
Here, Andy.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the first session, or at least in this stage. I am Mary Harvey. I'm the Chief Executive for the Center for Sport and Human Rights, and we have 20 minutes to cover 12 years of labor reform in Qatar. So bear with us as we try to do this. So how do we ensure a positive social and human rights legacy from the 2022 World Cup in Qatar? We're fortunate to be joined today by three great speakers: Mahmoud Qutub from the Supreme Committee, the local organizer, the ILO office, Max Tuñón from the ILO office in Doha, and Andy Spalding, who has an academic who has researched this extensively. So there's never been, I think you'll all agree, a World Cup delivered under so much scrutiny. And we have time today to just scratch the surface. So before we start, let's acknowledge, again, who we have here today. So the World Cup organizers, the UN body responsible for labor rights, as well as an eminent academic. But I'd also like to, at the same time, acknowledge who's not here today. And those are the stakeholders, namely the workers, the migrant workers, their representatives, journalists, and many of the human rights groups who have worked to draw attention to human rights concerns in Qatar over many years. So I'll try to help fill in some of their perspectives in my questions to our speakers. It's important to recognize that every country has human rights challenges. No one's immune. But the challenge of hosting a World Cup brings a spotlight. In Qatar, the spotlight has been relentless. We've seen coverage of deplorable working conditions, discrimination against people in Qatar, among them those working to make the event possible. Mahmoud and his team have been working under that spotlight for the past 12 years to deliver an event that is not only expected to elevate standards, but also serve as an incubator for policies and practice, some of which are now law in Qatar. That's a process where Max and the ILO are supporting a government that's made wide-ranging reforms to its labor laws and at an accelerated pace. And that kind of change, to really metabolize it, takes time. So as we hear from our speakers, let's keep in mind the migrant workers who comprise the huge proportion of Qatar's population. They are men and women from some of the poorest countries in the world who travel overseas to provide for their families. Migrant workers are an especially vulnerable population. They are vulnerable to gangsters who recruit and traffic them, and they are taken advantage of by unscrupulous employers. In 2010, when Qatar was awarded the World Cup, they were particularly vulnerable. At that time, the kafala system and its laws were still in place, which gave employers almost complete control over employers. And it was over its labor force. So it's in that context that the World Cup was then not only awarded, but then they start to build 7 stadiums and bring the infrastructure online to international standards. So we're going to do 2 things at once here today. We can have our eyes open about the human rights challenges in Qatar in delivering the World Cup, and at the same time acknowledge the groundbreaking change and reform that has happened in delivering the World Cup. So there's much to share, and let's get started. So right now, I'd like to start with Mahmoud. I've talked about the spotlight that you've had to do most of your work in. I think many in the audience are familiar with human rights challenges in Qatar. So what are some of the practical steps the Supreme Committee has developed to deliver better protections for workers? And what do you hope for the legacy of your work, both in Qatar and in future hosts for other mega sporting events? And if you want to touch on 2026, please do.
Sure.
Mahmoud.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks everyone for being here. It is surreal to really be here to talk about the World Cup journey. It's been 13 years since the original bid days. And the premise of our bid was really founded on the power of sport to unite and deliver change. Really, this is the fundamental premise of it from the beginning and one of the biggest legacy drivers for us. I was fortunate to be part of the bid team, and I witnessed firsthand really sort of the transformative effect of this particular sport. And it was really this unifying spirit of football that enabled us to engage with our biggest critics. And these are in their formative years, if you will. These are the steps that we took. We engaged with our biggest advocates or critics, as well as allies, of course. And it was really for the mere importance of engagement and dialogue, to learn from them, to discuss our differences, to discuss the challenges, to find common ground, and also to talk about the gaps that existed within the Qatari labor market at the time and how we, as the World Cup custodians, can actually fill that gap. And one of the first, probably groundbreaking initiatives that came out of this collaboration was the establishment of the Workers' Welfare Standards of the Supreme Committee. This was developed in 2014, and it really, in many ways, this was the cornerstone of our program, and it set the foundation and the principles for how we expect companies to cooperate with us and to ensure that they meet the human rights obligations towards their workforce. This was an important step in our journey, of course, a 12-year journey. Now, again, I think there's been the insight that came out of this exercise was really, really tremendous. And I think one of the things we did identify early on is that companies just didn't know what they didn't know. And I think we really took it upon ourselves, particularly with the contractors that have engaged on our program, to educate them on their human rights obligations. And this, in fact, even today, we're still 10 years on, we're still doing that. We're still training them. We started with the construction sector. We've now moved over to the hospitality and the services sector. And it's absolutely has been one of the probably best key policy decisions we've taken is to really take them through that journey. And what we've started to see early on is really subtle behavioral changes that started to occur between employers and employees, between employees within the same sector, exchanging ideas, exchanging knowledge on how to improve the welfare of their staff and their resources. So they became a lot more empowered. They started to engage more to try to improve the conditions. And this was really, really under the spirit that I mentioned earlier about the power of sport. And this collaborative nature, I think in many ways, one of the big breakthroughs that occurred as a result of it was the establishment of what we call the Supreme Committee's Recruitment Reimbursement Scheme, which we launched in 2017. This is an unprecedented achievement, a testament to the collaboration with the contractors, with all the stakeholders that were part of our journey. And what it effectively did is it effectively got the contractors to repay the unethical recruitment fees that many of the workers in Qatar working on our program had paid before coming. And this is quite extensive, as you can imagine. I mean, this is a global pandemic in its own right, and it affects over 25, 30 million workers globally. And our 266 of our contractors effectively agreed to reimburse $28.5 million to about 49,000 Supreme Committee and non-Supreme Committee. $28.5 million. And again, and the importance of legacy, Mary, and this is, I think, what's important is a lot of what we're describing today is really legacy that has already been achieved even before the ball has been kicked in November of this year. 22.5 million has already been reimbursed. That's actual funds that have gone back in the pockets of workers. So you can see the commitment that the companies, once they were more aware and alert about the challenges and the issues, really did the right thing by righting this wrong. This was only paralleled by Apple. Apple, over a 14-year period, reimbursed 32 million to about 37,000 workers. We don't know of any other case globally that has done anything remotely close to this. Another important breakthrough that came through was around worker representation and access to remedy. This is an important issue in an environment where labor unions and collective bargaining is not a viable option for workers. We innovatively came up with a mechanism, and it's a three-tiered mechanism to allow workers to be able to air their grievances without fear of retaliation. The system that we founded, called the Workers' Welfare Forums, has been established across all of our construction sites. We've now moved it forward, and we're promoting it within the hospitality sector. 45 of the big names, the 5-star, 4-star global chains, are now adopting the Workers' Welfare Forums. And they have effectively been modeled, or at least been monitored and observed by the Ministry of Labor and the ILO in forming the joint committees. And the joint committees, of course, this is the more long-standing committees that will be established in Qatar as a result of the technical cooperation between the ILO and the ministry. So we're very proud, and again, this is where I think in many ways the legacy of the World Cup has already really played a key role in that. And the last point, and I think this is an important one also in terms of the power of sport that we've been able to leverage on, is in the area of health and safety. Often you hear about heat stress being a big issue in the GCC in our region. But we really used that power to really push forward a strong health and safety agenda that looked at ensuring comprehensive medical examinations for all workers working on our program. We also instituted a first-of-its-kind medical record system that integrated all of their records across all of our sites. And last but not least, and something I'm very proud of personally, is we came up with an innovation, really. I mean, I think this is really something that's quite unique and very innovative in the construction and industrial workwear industry, which is effectively called Stay Cool. It's a cooling suit that actually lowers the body temperature by 8 degrees Celsius. And we've deployed this to about 50,000 of our workers across the board. It's gotten a tremendous amount of attention recently on a global scale, where now we've been engaged with many, many companies who are interested in this, including Google, including a lot of the big projects that are happening in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. We're very sort of bullish on this particular product and really, really proud of it. And it's been a game changer. And so I think fundamentally, really looking at some of these key achievements, Mary, just to wrap up and conscious of time, you know, I cannot emphasize that starting early is really key in all this. Collaboration is absolutely paramount. We'd like, and we are really pushing for our work. You know, obviously Qatar has a lot to be proud of. And I think the legislative reforms that have taken place over the last few years, quite historic, both in the pace as well as the scale. Mm-hmm. We're very proud to have been part of that, to support it, but it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop in 2022. And this is where I think fundamentally for us, we'd like to see our story and the work that we've done be able to be extended to 2026, to other mega projects. And we're obviously big advocates of this, and hopefully we can continue to support.
Well, legacy and transfer to 2026, where the World Cup will be held in North America, is very, very important. Max, we've heard a lot about innovation and change, but that's inside the World Cup. So what is the spillover now into other areas within Qatar and the region? And then could you touch on what challenges still remain?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Mary. So I think, as you said, the Supreme Committee has very much been an incubator in which some of the practices within World Cup sites have now influenced national law and policy. Let me give two very concrete examples. One is on heat stress. In 2019, we co-commissioned with the Ministry of Labor and the Supreme Committee the most groundbreaking research that's ever been done on the impact of heat stress on workers' health. And we tested a variety of mitigation strategies. How could we control and make sure these workplaces are safe? That research informed what I feel is the most comprehensive, most progressive legislation on heat stress around the world. Now, from the 1st of June to the 15th of September, from 10 a.m. to 3:30 p.m., all outdoor work in Qatar is prohibited. And in addition to that, there are a number of other safety provisions that are included in that legislation, including the requirement for outdoor workers to undertake mandatory health screenings once a year, something that the Supreme Committee has already institutionalized. So that's a concrete example of how a practice that was developed in cooperation with the SC has informed national legislation, and I feel will have an impact on the borders beyond Qatar. We saw this summer how workplaces are changing due to the impact of climate change. You know, workplaces are getting hotter for workers around the world, and I think this legislation really can inform, and the research can inform legislation outside of Qatar as well. The other example relates to workers' voice and workers' representation. In 2019, the government of Qatar adopted legislation around the establishment of worker welfare committees. And in the process of that, we together studied the worker welfare committees that Mahmoud referenced earlier. That helped us to design the legislation, make sure that the space was created to enable very constructive dialogue between workers and management to resolve any issues that emerge in their workplaces. That's taken off in a big way in that the government is very much supportive of this initiative, supportive of how this can help to resolve issues before they escalate. And we are now working with the Supreme Committee and the Ministry of Labor to roll these out across the hospitality sector. So really, two very concrete examples of how this change has had a broader impact. On your second question about what remains to be done,
Yep.
I think it's important to know that, I mean, the ILO has been in the country since 2018, and from 2018 to where we are now, we've seen really tremendous amount of change in a very short period of time. A whole new raft of legislation, new systems on board, and cooperation with a number of new institutions and partners. Things are definitely moving in the right direction, but we still see challenges. One of the functions of the ILO office is to receive complaints from workers, and on a daily basis, we hear about workers not receiving their due wages. We hear about workers who struggle to change jobs because their employers are retaliating against them, threatening them with deportation. We hear about domestic workers, for example, working really excessive hours and not having the right to a day off per week. So there are still many issues that remain to be resolved. That said, we know at the same time hundreds of thousands of workers have benefited from these reforms, and the workers themselves recognize this. In a survey that we recently concluded, 86% of workers, low-wage workers, felt that the labor reforms had a positive impact on their lives. So things are progressing, but it does take time to build these institutions, these systems that are still new. For us, and I think for the Ministry of Labor and the other partners, the World Cup is not the finishing line. We know that this is a long-term endeavor, and we will continue to work with the government and other partners to ensure that all workers can benefit from these reforms.
Terrific, Max. It's a terrific sort of sketch of it. Now, Andy, this is unprecedented, right? And you've been looking at the impact of mega sporting events on change, on instigating change, and enduring change. So what kind of legacy do you think is possible in Qatar? We've seen enormous change, and it needs to endure. So what's possible? And then maybe, what do we take away from that as we look at, again, North America?
Right, thanks, Mary. So we've used the word legacy a lot in this conversation so far. And what do we mean by legacy? Most of us think of infrastructure, physical infrastructure. We think of economic returns, but legacy can take many forms. A legacy is the lasting impacts of the games in the host country. We ask several years after the games are over, after the last match has been played, after all the fans have left, several years later, what are the lasting impacts of the games? And if you listen carefully to what has happened here, the story of how standards that were developed specifically for World Cup work were then translated into national policy, legal reforms that are not specific to the World Cup, but apply to the entire labor sector and, barring some kind of dramatic political change, will remain in place after the event is over. Right? That's a legacy. Legacy can be laws, legacy can be standards, norms, best practices, it can be familiarity with international law, it can be social networks. And if we think of what the World Cup has done in Qatar, and specifically on labor reforms, but also on other issues, and if we think of how far Qatar has come from 2010, when they were awarded the bid, to now on the eve of the Games, and we hold up Qatar against any other host country, to be perfectly honest, right? If we're comparing countries on how effectively they leveraged the World Cup to effectuate reforms at the national level, there's no comparison. Qatar has done something that we have never seen a host country do, which is to use the World Cup or any mega sport event as a kind of incubator for new policies, new practices, and based on the successes that we observe, incorporate those new norms, new standards into mandatory federal law. That is a remarkable legacy for Qatar, the likes of which we've never seen, but it's also a legacy for future megasport hosts, because 2026, when the World Cup comes to North America, that's going to create a new set of human rights challenges, some of which will be a little harder to document. We have the notion that companies doing business with the World Cup should have human rights obligations. They have an obligation to adopt human rights compliance, or what we call human rights due diligence. That's a very foreign concept in the United States. It's prevalent in Europe. It hasn't gained much traction in the US. We know anti-corruption compliance very well, but we don't do human rights due diligence for corporations particularly well. So there's going to be a new set of challenges, a new set of conflicts, a new set of negotiations. And it's important that we get the Qatar story right so we can understand just how much work a megasport can do, if it's done well, to effectuate lasting reforms in the host country.
That's amazing. Okay, so this has been a fascinating, for me, incredibly important case study. And for us at the center, this must be successful. Mm-hmm. It's critical that this is successful because the region has a lot of ambitions when it comes to hosting mega sporting events, right, in future.
Right.
And at a minimum, what we've seen, the change that we've seen in Qatar, that's a minimum standard now. That's a minimum standard for others who are starting from the same place.
Right.
What are they prepared to do to move forward? So I'd like to close with a notion that doing this kind of change isn't just any one actor's responsibility. It's not just the local organizing committee. It's an ecosystem. And the ecosystem has to enable that kind of change. It takes FIFA, the event owner, having a human rights commitment and making a commitment to the UN guiding principles. It takes a local organizing committee to undertake the kind of innovation and change. It takes UN agencies to implement, along with a government, another key actor, the labor reforms. It takes sponsors doing their due diligence in line with the UN guiding principles, which they've signed up to. Whether or not that's popular in the US and North America, that is, as they say in German, is mir Wurst. It is actually, nonetheless, a responsibility. And so it is all of our responsibility to ensure that these mega sporting events, the legacy endures. And in North America, what's interesting is not a single new stadium will be built. So very much the legacy of that World Cup will be in human terms, as we've seen in Qatar. Gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating panel. Thank you so much, and best of luck as we get ready for the World Cup, which kicks off in how many days, Mahmoud?
60 days, I think.
60 days, okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much.